Hi, everybody. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Hi, Patty. How's tricks?
Tricks are fine. I'm doing great.
Okay.
It's a beautiful late summer afternoon, and I'm doing beautifully.
Nice. Good to hear. So, I'd like to thank all of our subscribers and listeners. And if you're watching this and you're not a subscriber, please consider clicking the subscribe button that's down below. You also find a link in the description for our link tree where we have links to all of our various and sundry Facebook groups, email address, everything like that. And so with that, I think I'll turn things back over to you and be surprised with what we're going to hear about today.
Okay. Now, I'm going to preface this one with the listeners that I want you to understand and follow through with this. Bear with me. It sounds ridiculous, but as we go through this journey, it's not as ridiculous as it sounds. We are going to talk today about not deer.
DEER or DEAR?
DEER, not deer.
Okay.
So,
It's the first I've heard of it.
I've been following it for a long time and really intrigued with it. And the more I deep dive into this subject, the more fascinating it becomes. And I'm hoping to not just reiterate the stories that other podcasts might have told and other books and what have you, but to go into connecting it together in a way that I have not yet seen it connected. So bear with me. So here's the premise. It's 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock on a winter's night. You're driving home from your best friend's house after having dinner with them, and you drive through a long rural area, and you're used to the deer. Deer's a big issue all across, particularly, all across the world. There's problems with deer. Now this takes place mostly in Appalachia, which is from New York all the way down through the Carolinas and what have you. So it's a large swath of territory. That's where the vast majority of the stories are from, but by no stretch of the imagination, all of them. So you're driving along. It's like I said, 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, and you see a herd of deer. So you immediately hit the brakes, slow down, and you're waiting. They're kind of milling along the edge of the road by a cornfield, and some of them have wandered into the road. You stop, and the deer start to move by, and you notice this one. It's just different. Something's wrong with it. And you're watching it, and you're like, man, that thing's huge. What is that? And then it turns and it looks at you, and it looks at you straight on. Anybody who's ever been around deer know their eyes are on the sides. They do
Right.
the periphery vision thing. This one is deformed. Its eyes are straight forward, and it's looking at you. And suddenly your hackles go up, and you're like, this thing sees me, like really sees me. Your eyes meet the animal's eyes, and you know it's looking at you. And then it does the most insane thing you can imagine. It stands up on two legs and follows the rest of the herd across the road into the darkness. And when it does that, you realize there's something definitely wrong with its legs. It's crippled, broken, they're backwards somehow. The joints are wrong. And then it's in the darkness, and that terrible feeling of dread is replaced by this feeling of run! And you hit the gas and you take off. That's not deer. There are stories from all across the world, literally, but particularly the Appalachian region, of these animals, and they're not all exactly the same. The only thing it is the same about them is they're not deer. When you look at them closely, you know they're not deer. That's hence the term not deer. So they are taller, beefier, larger antlers. Their eyes may glow, not eye shine, but literally glow. Some of them, a lot of them have sharp pointed teeth like a wolf, or just canines teeth. They have too many eyes. Sometimes they'll report like down across their cheeks, there'll be other eyes looking at them. The legs can be twisted backward or bent wrong. They can, as I said, run on 2 feet. They sometimes appear alone, but often they hide in a herd of deer and are seen that way. They're terrifying. They date back through at least half of the 20th century. But when I deep dive, I found out that they went back a lot further than that. This reiteration of them as a not deer is maybe from the 1940s, 50s, somewhere in that range. But a very similar creature has been going back through time into the ages. And we're going to talk about that later. They do not move gracefully. Sometimes they'll glitch, almost like a computer program where they are moving and it's jerky and almost robotic in nature. And they can be very aggressive. They will walk right up to a car. They will come at you. And often those who see them walking, even if they walk on all four, they talk about them walking oddly like a newborn fawn. You know how they do that stumble walk, stumble walk, stumble walk thing? That's what I'm talking about. They could have long tails that are bushy or no tails at all. Some rare instances talk about them having arms and hands. Some talk about them having pads on their feet instead of hooves. They're more often seen at night, but not always. And they are seen, as I said, all across the world, but particularly in the Appalachian region. At least they're being reported more often now in the Appalachian region. They started a few years ago being talked about, and somebody basically, it's on the internet, and somebody basically said, oh, I know these stories. I come from an area where there's a lot of hunters. We've been hearing these stories for my whole life. We just call them the not deer. Now, you might also call them Deor. D-E-O-R is another phrase that we hear, particularly in the South. There'll be the Deor. And I looked it up, but a Deor is a lament. So it's something that's sad or what have you. But anyhow, that's the two terms you'll find, not deer, which is the most popular, than the Deor. So I want to go back before the internet. There are pre-internet stories that are fairly specific. So we're going to go to 1939, Pennsylvania, to Westwood area, and it's the middle of February, bitter, bitter cold for those who don't know what Pennsylvania winters are like. Februarys can be extremely cold, windy, what have you. So a guy by the name of Mr. Scott is outside with his dogs, and the dogs are all excited and rah, 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 carrying on. And all of a sudden they get very quiet. And he's like, well, looking around, and that's when he sees it. He says that it's approximately 3 feet high to the chest. That's huge. That it had paws, not hooves, a long neck, no tail. And as the dogs saw it, the dogs backed away and would not follow. Normally they would chase a deer. He heard it crashing off in this. He's watching it running, and it looks bizarre, and he's trying to make sense out of what he's seeing with this animal with pads, not hooves, clunking through that looks like a giant, monstrous, deformed deer. And he would say later that, and when he was interviewed, that he would hear something that sounded like this thing. It gave a scream as it was running away, and he would hear those screams on several other occasions. What it was, he doesn't know. He didn't know his whole life, but he definitely was terrified by whatever it was he saw. We're going to fast forward to 1951 to a Mrs. Loeb. Mrs. Loeb was outside, and she saw this thing in her yard moving around. She kind of looked at it closer. It was about 20 feet away, and she could see that it had pads for feet. Its fur was long, light brown, and it had small pointy ears and a bushy tail. It frightened her, but she had a little bit of context because her husband had claimed to have seen something very similar 2 years earlier in their yard, and she had laughed it off at the time because she didn't believe it. She picks up a stick and she throws it in the direction of the animal to spook it, and instead it turns and it looks at her. And as soon as it looked at her and connected with her, that way, she panics. All of a sudden, this horrible dread wells up in her, and she goes running to the house and tells her husband, oh my gosh, that monster you told me about, you saw that deer monster, I saw it. And she would describe it as having, looking very aggressive. Now, something you should know, although I never knew this, so I'm going to pass this little bit of information on. deer are like cattle. They have they're ruminants, so they normally eat grasses and branches and stuff, but they can eat meat, and they will eat meat on occasion, particularly if there's certain enzymes and stuff that they're missing. They will do that. And there is actually a piece of trail cam footage that I saw from a body farm where they caught a deer eating a rib bone, and I think it was lacking calcium, and so it was like literally eating things that had calcium. So as weird as that sounds, if they don't have them the right minerals and enzymes and stuff, they might actually do it. But I'm not telling you that your normal deer that runs out in the woods is what this thing is. It's obviously not, because it's not deer. So I wanted to get into some of the stories first, and then we'll move on to the history, just because I want you to have a really good visual on what these things look like and how they appear. So we're going to talk about a guy by the nickname of Gris, and he wrote his account in, and he said he was on a motorcycle. He was driving along late one night in a rural area of Virginia, which if you've ever been to Virginia, there's a lot of rural area. And suddenly it just everything is quiet, like dead on quiet. It's almost like darkness or a shadow fell over the area. And his hackles kind of come up, and he's like looking around. He slows down, and he's like, what is that? He pulls off to the side of the road as he's trying to piece this whole thing out in his head, and it's completely quiet. He notices that there's nothing. There's no animals, there's no bird sounds, there's no anything. And so he's just sitting there for a couple minutes, kind of looking around. You never you get that feeling sometimes that you're not alone when you're supposed to be alone?
Yeah, because just last weekend, Mrs. Stu, who is a twin, went down to Virginia to be with her twin sister, and so I was alone for 5 days. But I didn't feel alone on 2 occasions.
Okay. So you know the sound.
I do know that. Yeah.
So the feeling, and so he's sitting there looking around like, what is there? He's looking for a predator, something huge that's going to come out, crashing out of the woods at him. And I have to tell you, if I were driving on a motorcycle at night in the wood, in a wooded area, I would be concerned, because there are predators.
Mm-hmm.
There's bear, and there's, in as much as you don't think of a deer as a predator, they are a dangerous animal that a lot of people die because of. And a motorcycle hitting a deer would be a really horrible thing. So he's looking around, and that's when he sees it. He says it's a very large deer creature, and it steps out into the middle of the road. This was the most bizarre part. It was a deer all the way from its neck down, but it had a cow's head, and it was huge. Its legs were too long for its body, and it had this huge barrely chest. He flashed his lights from his motorcycle and revved the engine, thinking it would scare this thing to move, whatever it was. But it reared up and began to walk awkwardly on 2 legs toward him. He said it shook its head like a dog with a toy, like going back and forth like that, and until it had crossed to the other side of the road. As soon as it hit the edge of the road, not too far from him, he gunned the engine and took off. And when he looked back, he could see that it was still watching him, standing on 2 legs, and he's looking in his rearview mirror. I can't imagine. So I'm going to share a couple more stories so that you get a really good picture of what these things are. This story is about 2 young women. The one lady lived with her aunt. She was kind of a night owl person. So her aunt would get tired of her being up, moving around all night, talking and carrying on the phone. So she would tell her, you can't talk after a certain time of night. And it's boring, and she's, sitting. So she decides to go outside and sit in the yard and talk on the phone to her friend. So she's sitting down in the yard, talking to a friend and trying to be quiet. Now, the area is known to have been a part of a Civil War battlefield. So she's kind of got the heebie-jeebies about ghosts. So she's like, I'll go out and I'll sit there. But when she starts to hear something, she gets up and she's looking around. It's like that cracking of wood or something like that. You know what I'm talking about? Snapping of a twig. And she's looking around, and that's when she sees this deer in the bushes just on the side of the house, and it steps out a little bit. She can see part of it, but she can't see all of it. So she doesn't have a good frame on it. It's nighttime, the lights are on, so she definitely can see it's a deer. But she's not sure about anything much beyond that. It's a deer. And then it turns and she realizes it's looking at her. And she's like, okay, that's kind of creepy. I know deer can be dangerous. People don't realize it, but a buck and rut is a very, very dangerous animal. It will attack you. So she's like, I think this discretion is the better part of valor, you know? So she's starting to think about how she's going to get to the door of the house and get out of there before this thing comes after her. And it's at that point that it turns and catches the light better its head, and she realizes it has a dog, like a Doberman's jaw. It's just very odd looking, and it's just creepy. And then she said its mouth was almost like the dog's snout more than a deer's head. And it started moving toward her on all fours, and that's whenever she bolted for the door. And she's like, whatever it was, and I hit the door, I'm yelling to my friend, I don't know what this is, I don't know what this is, but it's not a deer, it's not a deer, it's not a deer. Now, most of these people didn't have any perspective on that concept at the time. It's later on when they start looking for other things, you know, what an animal that looks like a deer, but it's not a deer, kind of a thing, that they begin to come across some of this stuff. I'd like to share this story. There was two young men, and they were gathering holly in the winter for the holidays. They're out in the woods, you know, just gathering it up, and they have a big bucket that they're taking and putting it in so that they can take it back into the house. And it's during this period of time, the one guy runs to go grab the bucket. The other one starts moving forward into the woods looking for more holly to clip. And he said he looks up and he thought he saw a baby deer laying down, you know, a small deer, young deer, laying down in the brush. And as he's watching it, and he's like hunkered down, kind of like, oh, I bet that's a baby. It's a little deer. And he's going to watch it, right? Being real stealthy and quiet. This thing rises up on all fours. And he said that was when he knew there was something seriously wrong. And suddenly he was terrified, absolutely terrified. He said, I took off running. I passed my brother and headed for the house. And he said then it dawned on him as he's running why it was so terrifying. It had too many eyes. It had eyes all on its face, several places on its face. And its legs were too long, and he thought the joints were bending the wrong direction, backwards instead of forwards. And he's running and he keeps on going until they get to the house. His brother's not sure what he's running because of, to be honest. I think he's probably just running because if somebody runs, you run with them, you know, there's this problem. There's a sense of fear that kind of envelopes you. So they get to the house, and to his absolute surprise, his brother says, oh my God, did you see the deer? Did you see that crazy ass deer? And he's like, did you see it too? And that's when they both admit that they saw the deer, and that's when they start talking about it. So whatever it is, it's a deer with multiple eyes on its face. Its legs are going backward. And it's just bizarre. So another story that I'd like to share about this one comes from the Midwest, or excuse me, from South Dakota. So this is a young man who's in college in the South Dakota, and he gets pretty sick. So he goes to the emergency room. Now, it's a very sparsely populated area, and you have to drive a long distance to get from one place to the other. Central Pennsylvania can be that way sometimes. So you know what I'm talking about. Like, you have to drive 45 minutes to an hour for me to get to a hospital, because our local hospital now does nothing but refer you to the hospital elsewhere anyway. So
that's a good gig, right?
I mean, seriously, everything you go there for, they're like, you have to go to, to out the city. We can't deal with that. And that's basically all we get anymore. But anyway, he goes to the hospital. He's exhausted. He gets treated. They give him some medication. And he starts home. It's about 2 a.m. by the time this is all done. And he's driving down. It's a regular old 2-lane highway, and he's so tired. And he gets nervous that he's going to fall asleep at the wheel. And that's the last thing. So he sees this place where he could pull over. It's a big, wide spot. It's very safe. And he thinks, I'll pull over, I'll lock the car doors, I'll sit there for 10 or 15 minutes, see if I can't wake myself up, and then I'll start out again. So he's sitting there. He's left his car running just because he wants to be able to see what's around him, and he's not planning on staying more than 10 or 15 minutes. And he's like just trying to wake up, and then all of a sudden, out in the front of his headlights, he didn't see it coming. He only saw it there, was this huge deer. There was woods on one side and there's farm fields on the other side. So his first thought is, oh, it's headed for the field to get something to eat, because they eat a lot of the leftover grains and what have you in the fields. And then a few other deer walked by behind it and didn't think anything of it until that large one passed through his headlights. And he said, that's when I noticed the legs were funny. They were odd, like they were broken. And he said, my first thought was, oh, the poor deer. And then he kind of cleared his head, kind of cleared a little bit. And he's like, wait a second. If you have broken legs, you can't walk on them. How's this thing walking on broken legs? And that wakes him up, because it's just something that doesn't make sense. And he said its gait was off. It was jerky. Again, that movement that he talks about it being like hopping, but I think from what I'm gathering from this, that it's more like that, the walking of a baby deer. When, like I said, when they first start walking, or a baby calf or anything, they do that stumbly, can't get everything coordinated motion. It was that kind of a motion. And he said the other deer weren't spooked by it, so he was thinking, okay, so it's just a crippled deer. I'm good with this. But he's watching it, and as it's moving, and he's like, its neck's too long, its ears are too long, the legs are weird. This isn't a deer. Whatever this is just not a normal deer. When they got across the road, he gets back on the highway, and he's feeling very much like he needed to run. Like it was all he could do to stay calm enough to wait for them to get away from him far enough that he could pull the car back out. And he was not tired anymore. He was just totally in fight or flight mode and gone. He didn't know what else to do, so he decided to, barrel out of there as fast as he could go.
I find that really interesting that you said the deer weren't spooked. I mean, and when you first started out talking about, the example, deer spook very easily.
They do.
And so that makes me, already I'm intrigued. I'm curious as to why the deer weren't spooked.
And that's interesting, because you will find there are a lot of stories that talk about them being part of the herd, and the herd is never spooked, whether it just is enough like them that it blends in, or they've traveled with it before. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do know that in no story that I read did a deer like that in a herd of deer cause the deer to spook. And you're right, they're extremely easy to spook. And I would have anticipated it be the other way, but that's not how it's described ever. I've not found a single case where they say that the rest of the deer looked at it and then took off running or anything like that. So one more story before we start getting into the really interesting, odd part. So this is from a woman who was on vacation in the Appalachians, and she's rented a room in like a B&B on the first floor, and she wakes up the first night, and there is a deer standing on two legs looking in the window at her as she's sleeping. And she's just like, okay, this is creepy, but she's a city person, and it's just like, she's like, I'm just a city person. I'm not used to it. Apparently deer do this. I'm not going to make a big scene. I'm just going back to sleep. And she wakes up later, and it's still out there looking in at her. So she's like, okay, this is a once in a lifetime thing. It'll go away. Trying really hard not to panic. She pulls the blankets up again and goes back to sleep. The next night, she startles awake in the middle of the night, and there's the deer watching her again. This continued the entirety of her week there, always standing on two legs, staring in at her. and intently, and it creeped her out, which frankly it would have creeped me out, and I grew up in the woods. And I'm not telling you a deer won't come up to your window and snort. I've seen that happen before. But this intensity of standing there for hours watching you sleep is just not normal behavior for an animal. She just kind of marks it off until she goes home and she's telling somebody about it. She's like, there's the creepiest deer up there. There's this deer that was like a voyeur. It stood up there and watched me sleep at night. You know, it was just bizarre. And he's like, I don't know. That doesn't sound right. Deer don't act like that. And, you know, if anybody who's ever been around deer, they're not interested in human beings as a general rule. They just want you to go away so they can eat grass and corn and tree branches and leave them alone. And then over the course of time, she began to do a little research and she came up with this not deer thing. And she's like, I don't know what it is about this thing, but it creeped me out so bad and I don't even know why. Now, there are going to be a couple of those stories, more stories at the end, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what else it could be. First thing I kept hearing was the skinwalker. So let's get through the easy ones first. So what if it was wasting disease and the animal was just sick? It was acting bizarre because it was sick. So there is something, for those who don't know, that's called wasting disease, and it's basically the animal eats, but because of this disease, it can't get the nutrition out of the food. So it literally starves to death while trying to eat. And it's a kind of new thing. We haven't had it in at least in this region forever. It's sort of popped up about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, something like that. They began talking about it. And that's a possibility, but it doesn't fit the bill. It doesn't cause the animal to be anything other than emaciated. So what if it has mange? Well, anybody who's ever seen an animal with mange, they just lose their fur in large patches. It gets sore and scabby, but it isn't going to cause your joints to look weird. It isn't going to cause you to have canines. It's not going to do any of those things. So those are the things that people normally come up with, or just a deformed animal. Obviously, that's a possibility. There was this one case I read where it was a two-headed deer. And I kind of didn't use that case for that reason because, okay, there are two-headed people born. So even if I would say that it's a very, very off chance, knowing how difficult it would be for a deer to give birth to a two-headed, kid, it's at least in the realm of possibility. So I left that story alone. And then I moved on to, what else could it be? And like I said, I have other stories I can share, but the what else could it be becomes really intriguing. So I came across a creature called the deer man. And at first it looks like, it's just this bizarre thing. It looks like it's got antlers. It's on 2 feet. It's got hooves on its back feet, and then what looks like claws or fingers on the front feet. It's skeletal or skeletally thin with deer fur, and it's basically a piece of folklore. It's a great big animal with a deer, a big stag with a human torso and legs similar to that of a combination of a man and a deer's legs. It's usually well muscled, very fast, and it can transform itself from a regular deer to the deer man and back again, which I thought was interesting. So I came across this story. There's a story about this guy named Kyle, and he's out with a friend, and they're doing photography, photographing the night sky, and of course it's, they're also catching whatever animals come in their direction. If you're out there filming, you're not going to turn down a elk wandering past you or whatever. So they're taking photographs. Suddenly it gets kind of deathly quiet. It's really still. They decide it's time to pack it in. They just kind of get this feeling that they're intruding now. So they pack up everything and they get to their car. And that's when they get in the car and they start hearing this rustling as they're, settling into the car. And they think they're going to see a bear. That big kind of rustling kind of reminded them of that. So they get they're in the car, they're waiting for the bear to come out of the woods. Maybe they can catch that one last picture. You know how that goes. What comes out of the woods is a deer man. It is that creature I just described, and that's exactly how they describe it. They say it steps out of the shadows and lurches toward them. They are so frightened that they just turn the car on, take off as fast as they can go. I'd like to read an actual quote from the interview. He said, "We were scared S-less. Things got even quieter when we stayed there. While there, we heard a one ear-piercing scream or screech, almost a hunting screech of some sort that made my hair stand on end and gave me goosebumps even worse. With that, we just left the mountains completely. We felt as though we were not wanted there that night. The way the wildlife acted, the figure that we came across that the animals had to have ran from, and then that scream of which I can only find references to it that happens to be that of a banshee. I cannot forget what that figure was that we saw, as well as that scream. It was not human. It was not any of the wildlife that I'm familiar with from out there. And he's not the only one. Now, the origin of the Deer Man story itself comes from the Kewaunee Indians. The Kewaunee Indians, the Cherokee Indians, they had legends. This thing got resurrected in the 1950s by a newspaper editor in a little town called Kewaunee, Illinois, and he wrote these kind of tongue-in-cheek stories to kind of, spice up the newspaper and I'm sure sell a few extra copies. So it kind of came into the purview again. But the actual legend, when I looked it up, turns out that there really is a legend. And it seems like there's basically two stories. One is of the deer man and one is of a deer woman. And each of them have a different reason to be there. But they come out of the Kewaunee tribe and the Cherokee tribe. And they're talk about and what have you. So I'm going to talk about another one also coming from the same idea. This is from Canada, and I'm not sure I'm going to say this right, so I'm going to spell it for folks who might want to look it up. Ajarat, I-J-I-R-A-I-T, Ajarat. And again, I apologize if I butchered that. I wasn't trying to. And it's a shape-shifting creature that shape shifts into a caribou people. It comes from the Inuit and from upper part of Canada. So there's actually a book that was written in 1875 called Tales and Traditions of the Eskimo, in which a geologist, Dr. Heinrich Rink, described Greenlandic Inuit folk tales, and he talks about this creature in this book and how it's still believed and how people claim to still see it. And he shares stories about it. And in Canada, there's also another thing kind of like that. It's called the Okanagan Indian legend. And it is fascinating that it follows so closely. So it says, this also comes from a journal, the historical component of it from a journal written in 1892, and it's called The Account of the, and I'm again going to butcher this, Samilakani Indians of British Columbia. Again, my apologies. This was written for the Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. So this is kind of, sounds like it was a prestigious magazine. And this is a story detailing the legend of the Soni Apuhu, literally called the devil, a supernatural demon that the Indians believe has the body of a man, the head of a deer, with a human face covered with deer hair. The limbs are also those of a deer. From the shoulders sprang wings from a bat, and it was believed to travel. In Alberta, there are a string of alleged deer man encounters, and they date from like 2018. So these are not all just, really old off the wall stories. One of the encounters takes place in a little hamlet called Mirror, and it's a Sunday morning in 2018, and this guy and his wife are out, headed for a drive through what's called the Alberta Range Road. And as they're driving at a fairly low speed because it's foggy. It's early in the morning and it's still foggy. And he's driving, really slowly, kind of trying to see ahead, because anybody's ever driven in fog, you can't make any time. So all of a sudden, this great big deer emerges from the fog, and he slams on his brakes. This deer stands in the middle of the road, gazing at him, and they're waiting for it to, finish crossing the highway, and the animal rears up on its hind legs, towering over the vehicle. Now they're startled because anybody who's ever watched videos on the internet knows that deer can get on their hind legs and they can walk a few feet, and they'll do that battle thing when they're in the rut. But this thing kept walking. It walked fairly far, several, many yards. And so now he hits the horn, hoping that the deer will run, and it does, but it stays on two legs as it runs down the road and into the fog. This is not normal deer behavior.
Agreed. Yeah.
So supernaturally, the thing that most, and I don't know if it's the reason for this is because it's just the most commonly known animal creature now, but most people kind of tried to link the not deer to the skinwalker stories. Now, the skinwalker stories, just to give a very brief thumbnail, are a Navajo legend that they are shape-shifting witches that disguise themselves as deformed animals, and usually wolves and bears, but they can do deer, and that they are evil in nature and intent. There's a lot of legends around this, like that they have to kill somebody they love to gain the power to be a skinwalker, all kinds of different things. But just to get on the outside of it, it is believed that, or originally was believed that skinwalkers were benevolent medicine men who ascended as far as they could go and they couldn't go any further. And I think this is a cautionary tale because they could not go any further in nature. They sought out evil to follow the magic of the evil to find out what else was there. And isn't that kind of a cautionary tale for man? We're never satisfied. We'll go on and on till we destroy ourselves and everything around us, because we just have to know. We have to try. We have to do whatever. So that these creatures did the same thing, and that they can then turn into an animal, a man, a combination thereof. And I just thought it was interesting. But I have to tell you, I don't honestly think it's a skinwalker. If I were going to pick an animal for it to be, it would definitely not be that. It would be a Wendigo. And there's a reason for that. So the Wendigo is less well known, but definitely still a terrifying creature. I'd like to read you a little bit of what they look like. This is what a Wendigo looks like. There are two very distinct archetypes for what a Wendigo is. One is a very large-looking demonic beast, normally of head and skull of a stag, complete with antlers or horns. And then the other is a very pale, sickly, demonic-looking figure. But again, we come up with the Wendigo with the antler, the fur, the horns, and what have you as a possibility. And I think that it fits the bill more thoroughly, if you will. And I wanted to share. The earliest Wendigo legend came from the Algonquin-based Native American tribes, believing that an evil spirit or demonic entity could possess a human and in some case transform the human into other beings, other creatures. Previously driven to commit cannibalism as a desperate act of self-preservation, these evil entities could harbor feelings of greed and of anger, and they're not afraid of humans. In no story did I read that the animal spooked and ran away. In fact, there's this very, very bizarre story that we'll talk about in here in a minute. I just thought this was fascinating because their depictions are very, very similar to what people are describing. And I found it really interesting that they would go in that direction. I'd like to give you a couple more stories. There is one story about it, one of these entities, these animals, that a woman comes across when she's on her own in the wilderness, and it steps out of nowhere, again, this big deer-like creature. But this one has blue eyes, human eyes. And she's looking at it, looking at her. And again, it's looking straight forward, not out the side. And it looks like its skin is slipping. That's exactly how she describes it. Like its skin is warped or twisted and slipping. And it's got yellow canines and it looks deformed in so many ways, and it moves toward her. And as she's backing backward away from it toward her vehicle, she says it looks like it's even warping more, almost like it's glitching in and out. And it's terrifying. She's absolutely petrified. She gets to the car. She gets in the car. She's trying to get the keys into the ignition, the whole 9 yards. And she looks up, and it's in front of the car, and its skin is slipping more, and she can see bones poking through. Not poking through the skin, but like as though it's falling off of the bones, and it's showing itself in a way that almost like, you had a hide over you. I thought that was a really interesting thing. And she said the reason she laughed, she pulled out when she did, is because she began to see its mouth. It had lips, and it started to speak to her. And when that happened, she's gone. But she said the other thing that was interesting about it is she described this thing as looking at her through the car window with its blue eyes pinning her, and it smiled. And that's when she realized it had lips. And that terrible smile, just chills went through her. So I thought that was a really fascinating story. And I'm going to do one more story, and we will let the not deer go. This story I thought was really interesting. So this young lady grew up on a farm, and it was in a very wild rural area. She was an only child, so her parents had this little farm. They had chickens and what have you, and pigs and cows and all the stuff you have on a farm. And as she's growing up, there are times when her father will have to gather up the chickens that are dead. Like sometimes they'll come out and they'll find a dozen or so chickens dead. Now they have a dog, and the dog mangled a couple chickens over the years. And I have to tell you, when you see a dog mangle a chicken, it's exactly that. It's a mangled up chicken, dead chicken. This was different. Their heads were completely gone, just completely nipped off, if you will. She said he would be piling dead chickens on top, up and when I'd ask him what happened, he'd say, don't worry about it. Don't ask me. And she said the neck was snapped. It was gruesome. It was just as though something had pulled their heads completely off. She thought it was weird, but living in the woods, things happen. Animals, kill things. They just do. So they actually have and she said at the same time, there was this huge buck that kind of hung out in the area every so often, and they would see it. Her dad gave the buck a name, and he was very distinctive. He had a very big barrel chest, big set of horns, and he just walked in a certain odd, angly way. And she's like, we never thought much about it. We saw lots of deer. He would often come with the herd of deer, and he'd run through the fields or what have you, but he always stood out because they was so much bigger than all the other animals that he was running with. She said that over the course of time, she'd see him time and time again, and she would say to her dad, "Hey, I saw the deer again, that big deer." And he would say to her, let's go out and see if we can't see that big deer. And this went on for years until it got to the point where they both figured the deer should have died. Like 20 years went by. Okay, so we're talking a long time. Eventually, her parents decide to leave the farm and move to town. She ends up keeping the farm, and she's living on the farm by herself. Got a friend who lives in Europe, and she's talking to her friend. And while she's talking to her friend this one day, she decides to take her on a tour of the farm. So she's got her camera on her phone out, and she's like, "Hey, we're gonna walk over here. This is the place where the barn used to be when I was a kid." And she's just kind of giving that kind of stuff. Whenever this big buck comes out of nowhere, it's the same buck. It looks like exactly the same buck. She said, and I'm going to read you that part anyhow. She said, as I left the house out the back door to show off the lawn, I walked across the path which cuts into the middle of the woods, and I go deeper. As I get near the back end, my dog begins to walk closer to me, and I keep going despite the dog acting like it's frightened. This is very unlike him. and it begins to rain. So I decide to turn back. In the path about 50 yards in front of me, there is a tree that was not there only moments ago. All I had heard was what sounded like a stick breaking before I turned around to go back. So she's kind of puzzled because there's a big, log laying there that she literally would have had to have stepped over a moment earlier, and now it's there. And she said that the dog was acting very strange, trying to get to the house. She heard a high-pitched screech in the direction of the house, like if a rabbit had been killed. Anybody's ever heard a rabbit squeal? It's a
Oh,
very
yeah,
Go
it's a
ahead.
scream. Yeah, yeah.
It's a horrible sound. Well, she has a rabbit in a pen by the house, so she takes off running in that direction, and she finds the rabbit's dead. Its neck is broken. And she gathers it up. She's very upset. She tells her friend, I gotta go. She takes the rabbit into the house, wraps it up in an old blanket to bury it, and she goes out to bury it. She's really concerned that there's something going on now, something serious. So she leaves the dog in the house so it's safe. She goes out to bury it because she doesn't want to be stuck there at night with a dead rabbit laying in the house. It's just kind of creepy. As she's burying this rabbit, she sees a deer, the same size and shape as the one that she had seen for years, facing her. And she said, I was so angry about what had happened with the rabbit. I really wasn't thinking about the deer, but I finally got a good look at this thing. And this is how she described it. The creature was massive, but its body was torn bones showing through, and its head was more skull than flesh. And I forgot to breathe as I looked at it. When it was gone out of sight, I struggled to breathe again, and I went inside, not even feeling safe in my home. I took the dog the next day and was walking, trying to calm down when I approached the river, and as I did, the dog began to freak out. And I looked down the hill from us, and there in the water, knee deep, I saw it. The dog was watching it too. It came over the hill, and she's watching this large animal, she said, but it was just standing there watching her, and she said, I don't know, it looked like more of its skin had slid off. Maybe it was something that was part of our land. Maybe it had always been there. But after that day, after the rabbit had died, there were no more animals except for the dog and I. And so I never saw it again. Eventually, I would sell the property, but I've never heard of anyone else seeing it either. Maybe it had stayed there until the last of us were gone. It had either killed us or driven us off like it did my parents. Maybe it's a creature from hell. Maybe it's something of the earth. I just don't know.
You know,
And
I'm back at the beginning. I had some thoughts running through my head too. And how many times have we heard stories of government DNA experimentation? And yeah, they make these things and then just drop them off someplace.
yeah,
See what happens. Yeah. Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't bring that up, or unless you really think that what you saw would make it more apparent to be a demon or a
right.
Wendigo.
The reason I didn't bring that up was because
Mhm.
these things predate. Like you can go all the way back into Scandinavian history and
Mm.
find there are stories of these creatures. They seem to come like a lot of the podcasts and the stuff I read was really short-sighted, and that's my only criticism. I found them fascinating. They were really well done. I don't criticize it any other thing other than the fact that they kind of stop at the 1950s. Oh, they were found in the 1950s. But when I started going back to Native American legends from the Appalachians, from um, other parts of the world that are seeing these things as well, there are cultures like the Algonquin, like the Cherokee, like other in Europe, there are other people from other races who have stories that go back into antiquity of these half men, half animal, half deer, stag, caribou, whatever creatures, and they seem to always come with this mythical and almost always, not always, but almost always negative impact. So I looked at all these different cultures, and I realized that this came from all these different cultures, that this was a part of the fabric of around the world. I don't know what it is, but there are creatures, beings, vampires, um, ghosts, things like that, that are almost every culture in the world has them in some form or fashion. And although, like I said, when I read all the stuff and watched all the podcasts, they're all really modern stories. When you start digging backward, you find that they're not. That these whatever they are, these creatures, these not deer, are seen and talked about in Native American lore, in Europe. They're talked about in the Middle Ages, and further back than that. Whatever they are, they're still here. They're still representing themselves that way. I don't know what they are. Some of them I'm sure are misidentifications. Some of them I'm sure are people's imagination. Some of them I'm sure are people who want to get attentions for telling a cool story. But when you pull them all away, there's still going to be a small percentage that are something else. The question is, what is that something else? And that's a question I don't have an answer to.
Makes me wish the guys with the cameras who thought that a bear was coming out would have,
Yeah.
thought that.
There are some, because everybody's got game cams now, there are some really bizarre photos and videos that you can go out there and look at. Unfortunately, most of them are just exactly what they are, game cams shot in the middle of the night, kind of a thing. So they're not perfect and they don't have the right angles and all of that because nobody intended specifically to get that thing and they didn't shoot from multiple angles at the same time. But there are some pretty interesting suggestive little videos out there. You can like look them up on your own and see. Because we are mostly audio, I didn't go to the trouble of pulling them all together to share. But they're out there. You can find them.
Alrighty.
And that's the end.
All right. So that's all, folks.